Today we're going to talk about periodic functions, and that means that we're going to be talking about four main things: the period, the amplitude, the midline, and the cycle. So let's take a look at these vocabulary words. So the first one is periodic function, and that is a pattern of repeating y values or the range at regular intervals. So not just that there's a pattern, but that there's a pattern of repeating y values. The cycle is one complete pattern of a periodic function. So we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the spaghetti sine curve. The period is the horizontal length of one cycle. The amplitude is half the distance between the max and the min values of a periodic function. And the midline is the horizontal line, half the distance from the max and the min value. Okay? So let's take a look at what the heck this all looks like. So for the function, we are going to determine if it is periodic or not. If it is periodic, we're going to find the period, amplitude, midline, domain, and range, and then identify one cycle in two different ways. If it is not periodic, we just say not periodic, and we move on to the next question. So for this, in order to figure out if something is periodic or not, you want to see, can you copy and paste a part of this over and over and over again? And it has to stay at the same heights. So if I look here, the top of these are all at 2, the bottom of these are all at -1. I could take part of this and copy it over and over and over again. So this is periodic. And then we need to figure out the period, the amplitude, the midline, domain, range, and then the cycle in two different ways. So it's kind of up to you, which process or which of these you want to go through as you go. So we kind of need to figure out the cycle before we can figure out the period, the amplitude, the midline, some of those things. Domain and range, we know those things from the past, so we can jump straight to those first. Domain is all of the x values. So if you notice these arrows go, so this would keep going here to the left, and this would keep going here to the right. So our domain is going to be from -infinity to positive infinity. Our range is our y values. So our lowest y value is -1, and our highest y value is a +2. So those both get brackets because you can actually touch and reach them. All right, so the amplitude, let's go ahead and find that next. The amplitude is going to be half of the distance between the max and the mins. Well, here's your max and here's your min. So the distance between -1 and +2 is 1, 2, 3 spaces. So we're going to cut that in half. So let's see, we do 1/2. I'm going to say the absolute value of 2 minus a -1, which would be 1/2 times the absolute value of 3, which is just 1.5, or you could leave it as 3/2. Okay, the absolute value of 3 is 3, 1/2 times 3 is 1.5. So our amplitude is 1.5. The midline is going to be an equation, y equals, because it's going to be the line that's halfway in between these. So if I go from -1 up 1.5 spaces, or if I go from 2 down 1.5 spaces, again, it doesn't matter which one you are because the midline is equidistant from both of those, we would be at y equals +1/2 or +0.5, okay, or 5/10. Now, for period and cycle, we got to figure out what can we copy and paste over and over and over again. So I could start here at -2 and go to +2, and that's one cycle. I could go from the top to the top of the hump and just keep copying, pasting that over and over and over again. Well, we got to figure out another way to do that. Well, if I start down here at, that would be -4, I would go to the bottom of the hump there, which is at 0. So from -4 to 0, I could also take that and copy and paste it over and over and over again. Now, I could not use -4 to 0 and 0 to +4 because that is the exact same shape that I am copying and pasting over and over and over again. So I couldn't use that. I could start here at the middle, so at -3 over to +1. You could also use that, or you could go from -1 over to +3. But you just need 2 cycles. There are obviously infinitely many cycles that there are, but you just need 2 of them. And then for the period, it's how long one cycle takes to happen. So from -2 to +2, or -4 to 0 is 4 spaces. Okay, and this will start to go faster as you understand the process a little bit more. Okay, so same thing again. Let's look at this graph though. So we need to figure out if this is periodic or not. So one thing I noticed right off the bat is that, yeah, there is a pattern of this stair step kind of type thing going on, but they're not all staying at the same consistent Y value. So this one is not periodic. And we move on to the next question. Okay, let's take a look at this one. So here's this graph. We have to figure out if it's periodic or not, and then find all the stuff if it is. So this one is periodic because the top of this is staying consistent and the bottom of this is also staying consistent, and I can copy and paste over and over again. So this is periodic. We need period, amplitude, midline, domain, range, and then cycle. All right, so domain is -infinity and +infinity. That should be the case for any sort of periodic function that you got going on. Okay, if it's periodic, your domain is -infinity to +infinity. Your range, we got to figure out what the lowest and the highest points are. So we're going to say 0 to, this is counting by 2s, be careful. So then that was going to be from 0 to 3, which means the amplitude is halfway in between that. So halfway between 0 and 3 is 1.5. So you can show your work of how you got that, or you don't have to, it's up to you. All right, that means that our midline, if I'm at 0 and I go up 1.5 spaces, somewhere around there, or if I'm at 3 and I go down 1.5 spaces, again, somewhere around there, our midline is y equals 1.5. So that's coincidence that those are the same just because we're starting with one of our range values as 0. For the cycle, we're going to figure out what we can copy and paste over and over again. So I'm going to start here at -2. And I would follow this until I get to that same level again, which would be at 4. So that's one cycle. I could also start at the top of the highest peak here. So that would be 0 to following over to that top of the highest peak again would be 6. And the way that you kind of check yourself here, -2 to 4 and 0 to 6 are the same distance, meaning our period is 6. So if you figure out that one has a period of 7 and the other one has a period of 5, that doesn't work. They have to have the same period if it is a periodic function. Okay, let's look at one more of those. So here's this graph. We got to figure out if it's periodic or not. So again, we can copy and paste something over and over again. So it is periodic. If it is periodic, you have to find the following things: period, amplitude, midline, domain, range, and cycle. If it's not periodic, you just move on. Okay, so easiest one is domain. It's going to keep going on forever and ever, copying and pasting in both directions. So -infinity to +infinity. Our range, the lowest value we have is -2, and the highest y value we have is a positive 1. So here our amplitude is going to be half of that distance. So from -2 up to 1 is 3. Half of that is 1.5. If we are going 1.5 spaces from either the max or the min, we're going to have a midline of y equals -0.5 or -0.5. All right, for one cycle, I notice that I can start here, let's say, at 0, and I would need to go all the way over here to 4. I could also start at the top of this, which is at 2, and go back to the top again, which is at 6. And 0 to 4, 2 to 6 are both the same thing with a period of 4. Okay? So obviously there's lots of other ones, you just need to find 2 of them. All right, the other thing we're going to do today is determine the period and amplitude of a sine function. So standard form of a sine function is y equals a times the sine of b theta. The absolute value of a is the amplitude of the function. B is the number of cycles in the interval from 0 to 2 pi, so that's what we're going to be graphing on, from 0 to 2 pi. So whatever B is the number of full cycles. And then 2 pi divided by B is the period of the function. So we're going to take 2 pi divided by how many sine curves there would be, and that's going to tell us how long one sine curve is going to take to happen. Okay? So we're just going to practice this with a few functions. We're going to find the period and amplitude of the following. So we have y equals 2 sine theta. So we need period and we need amplitude. And I think amplitude is easier to find. So we're going to start with that. Okay. So this number out front, we take the absolute value of it. The absolute value of positive 2 is 2. The period, we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by b. B is the number that's in front of theta. So there's a 1 there. So 2 pi divided by 1 is 2 pi. So that means that one sine curve would happen, which means that sine curve would take the entire 2 pi radians to graph. Okay, today we are just focused on finding amplitude and period, and then we'll actually learn how to graph these tomorrow. All right, so what happens if we move that 2? Instead of it being out front, it is now in front of the theta. So I'm going to change up the order of what I'm finding because I know that amplitude is easier to find. Amplitude is the absolute value of the number out front. Since there is no number, it's a 1, so the amplitude is 1. That means that this sine curve would go 1 up or 1 down from the midline, which is the x-axis. Our period, we would take 2 pi and divide it by b, which means our b is 2 there. 2 divided by 2 makes it just be pi. Since 2 sine curves would happen by the time we make it to 2 pi, that makes sense that one sine curve would take pi radians. So the first one would be pi, and then the next one would be actually 5. All right, so what happens if we change both of those things? We have y equals 4 sine 3 theta. So again, we need the amplitude and the period. The amplitude is the absolute value of the number out front, so that's going to be 4. The period, we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by b. Our b is 3. And 2 pi divided by 3, that 2/3, we don't know how to simplify. So 3 sine curves would happen here. They would each take up 2 pi over 3 radians. Here's our last one quickly. We have y equals -2 sine of 1/2 theta. So our amplitude, we're going to take the absolute value of that -2, which is positive 2. And for the period, we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by 1/2, which means we're going to take 2 pi and multiply it by 2, which is 4 pi. Okay? So amplitude, absolute value of what's out front, period, 2 pi divided by b, and that's it.